I'm sitting in a police cruiser parking lot watching a woman in a designer raincoat pound both fists against the steel door of my workshop while screaming that I had stolen her Mercedes. The funny part was, her car had never left my property, and every single person standing there, including 2 police officers, knew she had put it there herself. 3 days earlier, I would have told you this was just another Tuesday in the life of a small business owner trying to keep a machine shop alive. But after everything that happened, I started looking at entitled people in a completely different way. Because sometimes the fastest way to teach someone a lesson isn't by arguing, threatening, or getting even. It's by letting their own arrogance do all the heavy lifting. My name's Ethan Carter, and I own a commercial fabrication shop just outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. Nothing glamorous about it. We build steel frames, repair industrial equipment, weld custom parts for local contractors, and occasionally save somebody's expensive project after another shop screws it up. It's loud, dirty, and honestly one of the few places left where people still judge you by whether you keep your word instead of what logo is stitched on your jacket. Every weekday starts almost exactly the same. Coffee before sunrise, lights on by 6, compressors humming a few minutes later, forklifts warming up while the crew drifts in with breakfast sandwiches and bad jokes. By 8 o'clock that morning, we were expecting a flatbed carrying nearly 40,000 pounds of structural steel, which meant every inch of the loading bay had to stay clear. There were giant signs everywhere. Private property, no parking. Active loading zone. Authorized vehicles only. I didn't buy those signs because I like decorating walls. I bought them because a forklift carrying several tons of steel doesn't stop like a bicycle, and one careless decision can change somebody's life forever. The weather wasn't helping either. Cold rain had been falling since dawn, turning the parking lot into a mirror of gray puddles and making everyone move just a little faster to stay dry. I was inside checking inventory when one of my welders, Marcus, leaned his head through the office door with a kind of confused expression that instantly tells you something's wrong. "Boss, you need to come look at this." I followed him outside expecting to see a delivery truck parked crooked, or maybe somebody had clipped the fence again. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks, sitting perfectly centered inside my loading bay, right between the yellow safety lines where my forklift needed to drive in less than an hour, was a brand new silver Mercedes SUV. It looked so clean it practically reflected the welding sparks from inside the shop. For a second, I honestly thought somebody had mistaken our building for another business. Then Marcus pointed across the street. She parked it herself. A woman wearing expensive heels was closing an umbrella while walking toward the coffee shop on the corner like she had just driven straight into somebody else's commercial workspace. I jogged over before she reached the crosswalk. "Ma'am, excuse me." She turned slowly, looked me up and down, and before I even finished speaking, I could already see the expression. You know the one. The look that says she had already decided exactly how much respect I deserved based entirely on my oil-stained work shirt. I smiled anyway. "I hate bothering you, but that's an active loading bay. We've got a freight delivery coming in, and I really need you to move your SUV." She glanced back at the Mercedes, shrugged, then looked at me like I had interrupted something much more important than running my own business. "It's raining," she said flatly. "The public parking lot is full, and I'll only be gone for a little while." I kept my voice calm. "I understand, but this isn't public parking. It's private commercial property, and we can't operate with your vehicle sitting there." She actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh, the kind people use when they think someone beneath them has said something amusing. "Relax," she replied, waving one perfectly manicured hand. "You're just a mechanic. My lunch meeting won't take that long." Mechanic. I hadn't been called that in years. Not because I think there's anything wrong with mechanics. Half my family are mechanics. It was the way she said it, like she was talking to someone whose opinion simply didn't matter. I tried one last time. "Ma'am, I'm asking politely because I don't want this becoming a bigger issue than it needs to be." She stepped closer, lowered her sunglasses just enough for me to see the irritation in her eyes, and smiled without a trace of kindness. Then stopped making it an issue. She turned and disappeared into the cafe without another word. Marcus had walked over by then. "Want me to call a tow truck?" he asked. I stared at the Mercedes for several seconds, then at the schedule taped to my clipboard. My flight to Montana for a long-planned 3-day inventory conference left in just over an hour. Every instinct told me to fight, argue, or waste half the morning chasing someone else's bad decision. But another thought quietly slipped into my head. one so simple it almost made me smile. Sometimes the most effective response isn't forcing someone to face you, it's letting them face the consequences all by themselves. I stood there for another few seconds watching rain collect on the Mercedes hood before I looked back at Marcus and said, "No tow truck." He blinked. "Seriously?" I nodded. "Seriously." There wasn't any anger left in me by then, just a strange sense of clarity. A tow company would have charged her a few $100. She'd complain to whoever would listen, and by next week she'd probably be parking wherever she wanted again. But this was different. My vacation had been booked almost 6 months earlier. Every hotel reservation was prepaid. My plane ticket wasn't refundable. And my shop manager already knew I'd be gone until Friday morning. I wasn't about to throw away 3 days I'd spent half a year looking forward to because someone believed the rules stopped applying the moment they bought a luxury SUV. We finished loading the last outgoing shipment that could leave before my flight. Then I gathered the crew. "Listen up," I said. "I'm heading out like we planned. Shop's closed until Friday." Marcus looked toward the loading bay and back at me. "What about, you know?" He pointed toward the Mercedes. I couldn't help smiling. "It's exactly where its owner decided to leave it." Nobody asked another question. They knew me well enough to recognize that look. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply refusing to rescue someone from the consequences of her own choices. About 40 minutes later, I walked through the building one final time, checking every workstation the way I always did before traveling. Welding gas shut off. Compressors disconnected. Security cameras armed. Inventory room locked. Then I reached the main control panel beside the loading bay. The massive steel roll-up door slowly rumbled downward until it sealed the entire entrance with a heavy metallic thud that echoed through the empty building. I engaged the interior deadbolts, wrapped the security chain through the locking brackets, snapped on 2 industrial padlocks, shut off the main electrical system except for security equipment, locked the office entrance, climbed into my pickup, and drove away. The Mercedes stayed exactly where it had been parked, dry, protected, perfectly safe, inside my building. By the time I reached the airport, I wasn't thinking about it anymore. Honestly, I was thinking about fishing. Montana in early fall had always been on my bucket list, and after months of 60-hour work weeks, I intended to enjoy every second away from ringing phones, late invoices, broken equipment, and emergency repair calls. My phone buzzed several times while I waited to board. Unknown number. Ignored. Then another. Then another. Finally, Marcus texted, "Think your Mercedes friend came back." I laughed to myself and slipped the phone into airplane mode. Whatever conversation she wanted to have now should have happened when I politely asked her to move the vehicle an hour earlier. The next 3 days turned into one of the most peaceful breaks I'd had in years. I hiked mountain trails before sunrise, caught more trout than I deserved, ate terrible roadside burgers that somehow tasted amazing after spending all day outside, and for the first time in months my shoulders actually relaxed. Every once in a while, I'd wonder if she'd gotten her car back somehow, but then I'd remember there was only one legal way into that building, with my keys. Meanwhile, back home, things apparently unfolded very differently. Marcus filled me in later, and some of it was confirmed by security footage and the police reports. According to him, she returned from lunch expecting to unlock her SUV and drive away without another thought. Instead, she found a solid wall of steel where the open loading bay had been. At first, she simply stared. Then she walked around the building twice looking for another entrance. Then she started pounding on the side personnel door. Nobody answered because nobody was there. She called the phone number printed on the business sign. Straight to voicemail. She left one message demanding I open the building immediately. 10 minutes later, another voicemail arrived, this time threatening legal action. 20 minutes after that, according to the timestamp, she informed me that I had committed grand theft auto by refusing to release her vehicle. By then, I was probably sitting beside a mountain lake watching an eagle fly overhead. She called again and again. Then she dialed 911. 2 patrol officers arrived within the hour. The body camera footage was something I eventually obtained through an insurance request, and honestly, it was almost painful to watch. She marched up to them, pointing dramatically at the warehouse. "That man trapped my vehicle in there." One officer looked at the locked building, then at the signs posted every few feet. "Ma'am, did someone steal your vehicle?" "No," she snapped. "I parked it in there." Both officers exchanged a glance. "You? Parked inside a private commercial loading facility?" "Only because it was raining." The younger officer blinked several times like he thought he'd misheard her. "So, The owner didn't move your vehicle? No. Did he damage your vehicle? No. Did he threaten you? No. But he locked me out. The older officer took a slow breath that probably came from years of experience dealing with situations exactly like this. Ma'am, based on what you've told us, your vehicle is located on private property where you voluntarily parked it without permission. She folded her arms. Then make him open the building. We can't force a property owner to unlock a secured commercial building when there's no emergency and no evidence of criminal activity. She looked absolutely stunned. It was as if nobody had ever told her no before. You have to do something, she yelled. That's a $75,000 Mercedes, the officer calmly replied. Then perhaps it shouldn't have been parked in someone else's loading bay. That line spread through half the neighborhood before I even got home. Apparently she wasn't satisfied. She contacted the HOA president, who happened to be one of her closest friends. They arrived together expecting authority to accomplish what common sense hadn't. According to Marcus, the HOA president actually tried explaining to the officers that community leaders deserved reasonable accommodations because the weather had been unpleasant. One of the officers politely pointed at the giant private property sign and asked whether HOA authority extended into privately owned commercial businesses located outside the subdivision. The conversation ended pretty quickly after that. The following morning, she hired a locksmith. The locksmith refused to touch the locks after seeing the ownership information posted on the permits. Later that afternoon, a towing company showed up. They laughed the moment they realized the car was inside a locked steel warehouse with no legal access. One driver reportedly said, "Lady, we tow cars out of parking lots. We don't break into buildings." By Wednesday afternoon, frustration had turned into obsession. She sat outside the building for hours hoping someone from my company would appear. Nobody did. She questioned neighboring business owners, trying to figure out where I'd gone. Old Mr. Dawson from the machine supply warehouse finally told her, "Ethan takes one vacation every year. You're probably going to be waiting a while." She apparently didn't appreciate hearing that. Security footage showed her pacing back and forth across the sidewalk, making phone calls almost non-stop, sometimes crying, sometimes shouting, occasionally kicking the bottom of the steel door hard enough to hurt herself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same woman who had dismissed my business as unimportant suddenly couldn't function without access to the property she claimed didn't matter. By Thursday, even the officers recognized her on site. One reportedly asked, "Still waiting?" She answered with a glare. They drove away. Late Thursday evening, she left one final voicemail. Gone was the arrogance, the sarcasm, the superiority. Her voice sounded exhausted. She said she just wanted her car back and promised she'd never park there again. I listened to that message Friday morning while driving home from the airport, and for the first time all week, I actually felt a little sorry for her, but not sorry enough to pretend none of this had been her own decision. As I turned onto Industrial Avenue, I could already see flashing blue lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement, 2 patrol cars parked outside my shop, and one familiar silver Mercedes still sitting exactly where its owner had left it 3 days earlier. Friday morning felt strangely peaceful. I had a cup of gas station coffee in one hand. My truck windows cracked just enough to let in the cool air. And somewhere between the airport and the shop, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Whatever frustration I felt 3 days earlier had been replaced by curiosity. I honestly wondered whether she'd learned anything or if she was still convinced the world somehow owed her an apology. As I turned into my driveway, the answer was waiting for me. 2 patrol cars sat outside the building. The silver Mercedes was still safely inside exactly where she'd left it, and sitting on the curb, looking nothing like the polished, confident woman I'd met earlier that week was the same woman in the expensive raincoat. Her hair was a mess. The designer clothes looked wrinkled, and the oversized sunglasses were gone, exposing tired, bloodshot eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much. The second my truck rolled to a stop, she jumped to her feet and stormed toward me. "There he is!" she screamed before I'd even opened the door. "That's him! Arrest him! He kidnapped my car!" I climbed out slowly, set my coffee on the truck bed, and looked at the 2 officers. One of them smiled just enough to let me know they already understood exactly what had happened. "Morning," I said. "Morning, Mr. Carter," the older officer replied. "Welcome back." The woman pointed directly at me. "Don't you say good morning to him. He locked my car in there for 3 days. He ruined my week. I missed meetings. I had to rent another vehicle. I've suffered emotional distress. I waited until she finally ran out of breath before speaking. Ma'am, I didn't move your car. I didn't touch your car. I didn't ask you to park inside my loading bay. I actually asked you very politely to move it before I left. She immediately cut me off. You knew I couldn't get it back? I shrugged. I knew I had a scheduled business trip and a secured commercial building. The officers exchanged another glance. The younger one pulled out a small folder. Mr. Axley Niger, Carter, before anything else, we'd like to document that your building remained secured. There were no signs of forced entry, and your surveillance system confirms the vehicle was voluntarily driven inside. Absolutely, I answered. You're welcome to review everything. Her expression shifted from outrage to disbelief. You're helping him? She asked the officers. The older officer remained perfectly calm. Ma'am, we're helping determine facts. So far, every fact supports what Mr. Carter reported. She threw both hands into the air. This is unbelievable. The officer looked at her for a long moment before speaking carefully. Actually, what's unbelievable is voluntarily parking inside someone else's commercial workspace after being asked not to. Silence followed. The kind of silence that only happens when someone realizes the conversation isn't going the way they imagined. I unlocked the side entrance, restored power to the building, and walked everyone inside. The Mercedes sat exactly where it had been parked, spotless, untouched, and completely unharmed. I couldn't help smiling a little. See, I said, safest parking garage in Ohio. Even one of the officers laughed under his breath. She didn't. She immediately reached for the driver's door, but I politely raised a hand. Before you leave, there's one business matter we need to settle. She stared at me. What business matter? I walked into my office, opened my computer, printed a prepared invoice, and returned a minute later. Indoor commercial storage for 3 days. Operational disruption, administrative processing, security monitoring. Total amount due, $1,500. She looked at the paper like it had been written in another language. You can't be serious. Completely serious. I'm not paying this. That's your choice, I replied. But until the outstanding storage charges are resolved, the vehicle remains inside my secured facility. Her mouth literally fell open. She looked at the officers as if expecting them to intervene. Instead, the older officer simply asked if she had parked there voluntarily. She quietly answered yes. Did Mr. Carter damage your vehicle? No. Did he prevent you from moving it before securing his property? Another long pause. No. Then this appears to be a civil matter. That was the moment everything finally caught up with her. The confidence disappeared. The anger faded. All that remained was the realization that every single problem she'd experienced that week had started with one decision she could have avoided by moving her car 30 feet. She called someone, probably her attorney, then another person, probably a family member. After nearly an hour of phone calls, frustrated pacing, and several defeated sighs, she walked back toward my office carrying a cashier's check. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit she was wrong. She simply handed me the payment without making eye contact. I processed the invoice, printed a receipt, opened the loading bay, and watched her climb into the Mercedes. Before starting the engine, she rolled the window down just a few inches. For a second, I thought maybe I was finally going to hear the words, "I'm sorry." Instead, she muttered, "You're lucky." I smiled. No, I just read the signs on my own property. She drove away without another word. I never saw her park anywhere she wasn't supposed to again. A few weeks later, I heard she quietly resigned from an HOA committee after several neighbors learned the full story. Whether that part was embarrassment or coincidence, I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. People often confuse patience with weakness. They assume that if you're calm, respectful, and willing to avoid confrontation, you'll eventually give in just to keep the peace. But sometimes protecting your boundaries doesn't require shouting. Sometimes it doesn't even require revenge. Sometimes all you have to do is let someone experience the completely predictable consequences of a choice they made all by themselves. Looking back, the Mercedes was never really trapped inside my shop. The only thing trapped that week was someone's belief that rules only applied to everyone else. Now, I'd really like to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have unlocked the building early and let her go? Or would you have handled it exactly the same way? And if you think I went too far, tell me why. Drop your opinion in the comments, because stories like this always seem to split people right down the middle. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next story.